Hello, you're watching the Great Canadian Bagel here, and today we have another U.S. federal presidential election forecast. Now, this is going to be the last one I plan on doing. I might, as I have in the past, post a final the final presidential update in a community post, or Twitter. I'm not certain though, because I don't actually think, outside of some popular vote movement, that the remaining polls that are coming in all seem to be pretty similar. So I don't think it's going to really change anything. Or if anything, it might boost Trump a little bit, but it's hard to say at this stage. But with that, I just wanted to shout out all my channel members. I really appreciate the support you guys give the channel, and if you guys want to support the channel and the work I do here and make it possible for me to do more or better work, then go down in the link in the description below and press that join button. Well, with that, let us begin. So the U.S. presidential election is in its dying days now. At the time of recording this, on November the 1st, there is just 4 days left. 3 really, because obviously there's not going to be much campaigning on actual election day. There's get out the vote and stuff like that, but there's not going to be the same kind of things. That's not, and frankly, at this stage, I don't really suspect we're going to see much in the way of voters changing. There might be some momentum that might be shown in the last couple polls if more come out, but probably not. Most of the time in elections like this, near the home stretch, there's really not that much movement. Now, for those of my channel watching, you'll know that in New Brunswick, for example, the Liberals greatly overperformed polls, but that's more of a result of there wasn't a lot of polls, and there was a lot of momentum the Liberals seem to have built up in the last week or so that wasn't being captured properly. Here, though, the momentum really does seem to be on Trump's side. If I bring up here, we can see since early September, Trump's up nearly a point in the popular vote, and Kamala Harris is down 1.5. So I don't think we're going to be seeing like a surprise miss on behalf of Kamala here. But what we might see, and I've seen this speculated before, and I think this is a reasonable enough possibility that I ran the numbers for it. So right now, the way my model works is it tries to forecast polling error based off of many criteria. But I can easily turn that off. So I turn off what I suspect the polling error will be. We actually get these numbers here. And this is essentially just a raw polling average with a few weights and stuff like that. And you'll notice this is very similar to something like Real Clear Politics, although I do have different math than them. But turns out you put the same polls and you're going to get a very similar number. And I'll note I did not draw another map up because this distribution of popular vote gives the exact same map as this one, with the only difference being New Hampshire and Maine are slightly safer for Democrats. Nevada and Arizona are a little less safe, as is Georgia, as is Michigan. So basically, across the board, the Democrats are doing a little better. But it doesn't actually flip any states. And the only 2 states that move into a different color category are Maine at large and New Hampshire. So I didn't bother spending time to make an entirely new map just to have 2 states be a different color. I'm not even entirely sure if the average viewer would have noticed that. And it's not a lot of work to make a map, but it's enough that I want to do it. So to me, this is probably the quote-unquote worst case scenario for Trump, because again, all indications suggest the Democrats should not overperform this election, overperform polling. People will say, oh, but what about 2022? The Democrats did not overperform polling in 2022. I believe the last time they did it was 2018, but 2018 is one of those years where it was a momentum thing. I'll just bring up the Real Clear Politics average here because they just have a nice graph. You can kind of see during October, like the start of October here, we have it at just 7.6 lead, 6.6 lead, sorry, math. And then by the end of it, we're now looking at like a 7.3 lead. So there is momentum here that the last few polls they missed. It is what it is. That does occasionally happen, but there is no such momentum right now for the Harris campaign. Again, we're going to bring up Real Clear just because they have a nice graph. You can see here from early October, not only is there momentum behind Trump, though it's flatlined in the last week or so, but the Democrats under Harris have collapsed. But if you don't want to believe the polling average of Real Clear, I could show you the polling average of Decision Desk HQ. Or if you don't believe mine. Again, same kind of thing. Early October, there's a 3.2 lead for Harris. At this point, up here you can see it's a 0.3 lead for Harris. So again, it collapsed. Or perhaps you don't like Decision Desk and you want to look at 538. And we look at, again, early October, it's about 2.8 lead for Harris. And now it's 1.2. Again, it collapsed. The momentum is very clearly at Trump at this stage. And there has not been a single election that I have studied where the polling error has favored the left and the left didn't have momentum going into election day. 2012, Obama overperformed polls, but he had momentum going into election day. 2008, same deal. 2004, same deal. That's not true here. That wasn't true in 2020. That wasn't true in 2016. In these elections, Trump had momentum going into the final day, and for various reasons, there is reason to believe that polls are going to methodologically miss Trump voters. The reason for this is not pollsters are malicious. It's not that pollsters are bad. It's that the methodology that a poll uses inherently is going to influence what kind of people it can reach. You can fix this by doing all sorts of stuff, but generally speaking, that's not going to change much. Pollsters don't like changing their methodology. It's expensive, it's hard, it has no guarantee of being better. And if they change it and it gets worse, that's deeply embarrassing and bad for business. And when I say methodology, I don't just mean like how they weight things or whatever. That's relatively easy to change. I mean how you reach voters and which voters you reach is going to change your data. If you are calling people, live caller, or if you go interactive voice response, or if you do an online poll, those are all different things. Is your online poll a very specific group of people? Is it like a focus group? Is it a really broad, massive database of registered people so that you can have essentially a fully randomized online poll because you have like hundreds of thousands of people in your panel? Or is it a very narrow band, but still a relatively random panel? All these things will get you different voter responses, and they will all get different biases. Now, what you'll see, generally speaking, online polls, online panels, broad-based online panels, something like if you're a Canadian, you'll be familiar with like Angus Reid or Leger. Anyways, those two companies, they're good companies. Don't get me wrong, but the nature of a broad-based online poll is it doesn't capture people who don't sign up for online polls. In other words, usually this counts to rural people. Oftentimes farmers don't join online polls. And that particular thing matters quite a bit in Canada or the US because farmers are a very polarized demo. In much of Canada or much of the US, you could very well see farmers break 90-10 to the right-wing party, in this case the GOP, but in like Saskatchewan recently would be the Saskatchewan party. And this causes polling in the rural areas to be off. So that's one example. If you go then look at, say, IVR, because you're like, okay, if we use IVR, it's cheap, because I'll get to all of them. But you might decide, okay, let's try IVR then. It's cheap, because it's a robot calling people. And since it's a call, it shouldn't miss any individual sample of the demographic. We're not going to miss farmers because they don't join online panels. The problem with IVR, though, and again, there's plenty of good companies that use IVR. It's not a problem for the company that does use IVR. It just has an inherent bias into it. But the issue you get with IVR, and you'll see this time and again with IVR polling firms, is that they over-poll passionate people. In other words, they get people who have the highest propensity to answer calls about polls, and those are usually the most energetic people, but that does not necessarily mean it is an accurate reflection of voters. That's why you'll see in like 2021 in Canada, the IVR pollsters over-polled the PPC by a lot, because the PPC base in 2021 was very energized. There just wasn't a lot of them, but they overperformed in polling on IVR because they're more likely to answer the phone. And then your third group, your live caller telephones. Now, you can make live caller telephone really good. There are people who do this really well. Again, in a Canadian example, because I don't know all the US polling firms like very intimately, but a Canadian example, Janet Brand in Alberta does this quite well. And she's mostly live caller. The problem with live caller, though, is it's expensive because you need a person dialing. So that can take a good amount of time and resources. But the other issue is if you have a very deeply polarizing person, such as Donald Trump on the other line, you get something called the shy Tory effect, where people don't want to admit to voting for a socially undesirable person. Now, you could argue maybe the shy Tory effect is not as big a deal anymore. Perhaps, but there's also fewer firms that do live caller, so it's very difficult to assess how true that is. And then you have your fourth group, which is your narrow poll focus group kind of thing. And when I say narrow poll, and in a sense, it's kind of how the polls I end up doing, which is very small sample size, but it's a quote-unquote politically active group of people. So you're not getting undecideds or low propensity voters. You're mostly getting high propensity voters kind of thing. And that kind of polling is cheap, relatively speaking, because you don't actually need a lot of respondents, and it's relatively easy to get them. And it's usually relatively representative. The issue with it, though, is if you have bad recruitment or bad weighting, it will create completely wrong results very quickly. In the polls I've done in the past, and I will just shout out that I was the best pollster in Saskatchewan. I'll post that in the Saskatchewan postmortem, but woohoo. The polls I've done in the past, I have to do a lot of effort with weighting them, making sure the weights are exactly correct, because it'd be very easy to get it wrong. And we get completely wrong answers. It would be trivial. So, this is all to say, there is no best polling methodology. But each polling methodology is going to get you different results. It's going to get you different problems, get different biases. Now, you can try to fix them. For example, if you're an online broad panel pollster, you can try your best to try to recruit a lot of people from rural areas, or you can intentionally oversample them. If you're doing IVR, you can do some shenanigans with weighting and all that kind of stuff to try to downplay the effect of people being really enthusiastic to respond to polls. Live caller, you can do a very strict script or just be very famous and notable for your accuracy, and then people will be more willing to talk to you. The second one's kind of hard. Not a very reliable way to do it. So, at the end of the day, none of these polling methodological errors are going to do not tend to miss in the way of the Democrats. The online panels, which is the most common type of pollster today, is almost always going to miss in favor of the right, or the GOP in this case. And IVR is probably going to also oversample the Democrats, because it seems like the Democrat base is more passionate than the GOP base. I could be wrong on this one. I'm not like doing a methodological study proving this, but from what I've gathered, it seems like they're more passionate, so they're probably more likely to answer the phone. Though if I'm wrong, maybe the IVR polls will be more accurate, but again, hard to say. And obviously with the telephone polls, you have Shai Tori. Now, I am not aware of any narrow panel polls that are in this election. I'm definitely not running one in the US because I don't have the contacts or the people to do so. My channel audience is not large enough of US voters to even meaningfully get that. So this is all to say, I expect, because of how the methodological polling is happening, that it should probably miss in the GOP's favor again. Now, it could be that these pollsters have done a lot of efforts to try to adjust this, in which case, maybe we will see something like this. But for the polling to miss to the degree that Kamala Harris wins would be astronomical. You would need probably the biggest polling miss in modern U.S. history. I'm not sure if it's all of U.S. history, because it's, again, I've not looked at every poll. Especially the further back you go, the more annoying it is to find polls, because internet links don't really survive past 10 years. So you have to actually go to archives or something like that to find them. You can't just look them up on Wikipedia or another platform, unless it's actually maintained. But in the time period that we can study, and really the time period of broad-based modern public polling being a normal thing that happens, such as the 2000s, it just hasn't really happened. There's not been a miss that big. 2016 was not that big of a miss. 2020 was not that big of a miss by E-Day. You look at 2020 polls, where you're really looking at a miss of 3.4. That's big. Okay, let's say instead of winning by... I could do this math in my head, but I'm a little tired, so I don't want to. Instead of winning by 1.9, Kamala Harris wins by 1.5. Okay, she wins by 1.5, she still loses. A 3.4 swing puts Nevada in her category, so she wins 6 more points. Huzzah. She still loses. And that's a big miss. You look at 2016, you don't see a miss that big at this stage in time. So there's really not a path here. There's not an obvious way that this is going to change. And people who are saying, aha, the polls are going to be wrong because this early voting turnout or that early voting turnout, or look, the early voters are all women or whatever. Again, I'm not going to say it's impossible, because obviously unprecedented things have to happen once before they can be precedented. Everything is unprecedented until it happens. But, and this is a big but, there's been really no correlation in any election I have ever studied between early voting turnout and actual election results, unless one party actively doesn't use early voting turnout. In other words, as long as everyone is trying to use early voting, you really don't see any major discrepancy between polls and early voting. The only real time you could say that happened was 2022 Pennsylvania Senate election, but I think that's more of a methodological error because they were not correctly sampling or weighting people who've already voted in Pennsylvania in 2022. A lot of people in Pennsylvania voted very early before that debate. And the debate, which was like the last 2 weeks of the election or something like that, changed the polls, but a lot of people already voted, so it doesn't matter. Which again, that's a digression. I won't get on that here. Okay, so as I've established here, we have a very unlikelihood that the polls should miss, or at least miss enough for Harris to win. And even if the polls are not missing in Trump's favor, Trump still wins by essentially the same margin, or the same or electoral college votes. So what went wrong? Why is Harris losing? Now, you could go into like lofty political theories. We could talk about, oh, this, that, and the other thing. But at the end of the day, Harris ran a bad campaign. That's the tweet. That's the story. She ran a bad campaign. Just looking at the last few weeks, what are the Democrat Party or their affiliates running in ads? They're browbeating men saying that you should vote for Kamala Harris because abortion, not a persuasive topic for men. They're saying, oh, men, you should vote for Kamala Harris because then the Republicans will ban porn. Not a persuasive topic for young men. Like for women, what are they saying? You should vote for Kamala Harris because of abortion. Again, not a persuasive issue for most people. I don't know how many times I have to say this on this channel. Maybe one day someone in the DNC will see this, but their position in the year of our Lord 2024 on abortion is a losing position and has always been a losing position and always will be a losing position. If you break the population into 3 groups, no restrictions, some restrictions, essentially a ban. Essentially, ban is technically 2 groups. There's like a total banned group, and then there's like a mostly banned, like banned except for like incest or whatever. If you break it into those 3 groups, the smallest group is no restrictions, which is the Democrat position. That's the smallest group of people. So Kamala Harris is running a campaign on a literally extremist view on a very divisive social issue. And that's her main thing. That's literally her main issue. That's the main thing her campaign talks about. Occasionally, as I mentioned, they'll talk about, the Republicans might ban porn. Which, dubious that they might do that federally, but they're definitely doing that state level. But they're not actually banning porn, they're putting age restrictions, and porn bans itself. Which, the subtext of that's pretty disturbing, actually. That the porn companies leave a state because they have age verification. That's actually disturbing, that the porn company leaves for that. But I digress. What about the main things that people care about? Cost of living is a really big issue in this election. Immigration is a really big issue in this election. The economy is a big issue in this election. And you don't really see substantive policies about Harris on any of those things. There's not any big claims. There's not any solutions on how do we stop illegal immigration? How do we reduce illegal immigration? Other than empty platitudes that you might occasionally see. In her time when she was supposed to try to help reduce immigration across the Mexican border in early Biden presidency, Kamala Harris went to the various Central American countries and tried to figure out the problem was why so many of their citizens are migrating to the U.S., and apparently nothing came of that. because nothing changed. So either she learned nothing, she learned that there's nothing that those countries could change. I'm not sure what, but nothing happened. Or you look at economics. Kamala Harris ran away from the successes of the Biden presidency for some reason. Across the board, there's a lot of economic successes under Biden. The CHIPS Act, the IRA. The IRA had nothing to do with inflation, by the way. Terrible branding. Well, maybe it was great branding, actually. I don't know. But nothing to do with inflation. It was a protectionist bill. An infrastructure investment bill, maybe, if you want. Biden raised tariffs, etc. There's a bunch of things Biden did that were big transformational changes in the U.S. And likely the reason why the U.S. economy is growing very hot right now, even with inflation. Now, a lot of the inflation issues are related to COVID and money printing, which wasn't good, don't get me wrong, but that part, it'd be easy to run away from, as Kamala Harris. But she's not just running away from the bad part, the excess money printing. She's running away from the good parts of Biden. She's running away from acts that caused massive investment in Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina. I wonder if there's something useful about those 3 states for Harris's campaign. I wonder if there's lots of jobs and investment that's going into those 3 states because of something Biden did that she ran away from because it's protectionist. If only there's something we could say. Well, she ran away from Biden's best policies and then did nothing in response. She's not campaigning on her own economic policies other than empty platitudes, which a lot of politicians do in her defense. But that doesn't make it a good strategy or persuasive for voters. And then the only other thing she has done in this entire campaign, other than run from Biden's record, campaign on divisive social policy, is just call Republicans mean names. Trump's a fascist. Stuff like that. That doesn't work. As I've touched on before in my BC series, slander ads don't work. End of story. You're not going to convince someone who likes Donald Trump's policy proposals to not vote for him because you called Donald Trump a mean name. It doesn't work. That's not how that works. If she does end up winning, it will not be because of that. It'll be because the Democrat get out the vote machine was better. Her campaign sucks. Like, objectively, it's a bad campaign. She's basically doing everything I would recommend as someone who studies election campaigning. Everything I recommend, she's doing the opposite. It's astounding. Astounding. She's like basically running the perfectly worst campaign you could run. And then you look at Trump, and Trump's running a perfectly normal campaign. He's talking heavily about economic policies. You might not like his economic policies vis-a-vis tariffs and stuff like that, but he's focusing on economic policies. And protectionism is popular in the U.S., so even if you personally don't like protectionism, it is actually a good thing to talk about as a political campaign. It's popular. People want that. And the curse of democracy is what people want is not necessarily the best thing, but it's also not necessarily the worst thing. Depends. And he's talking heavily about immigration. Illegal immigration across the southern border is a very strong issue. People really don't like that, surprisingly. And they want it to stop. And those are basically his 2 main policy points. You could say maybe a third one, he doesn't want to be entangled in foreign wars, which to some is a benefit, some it's a negative. But overall, that's just not... He's running a normal campaign focused on economic issues with a little splash of a very popular social issue, which is what you should be doing. And when I say a really popular social issue, I mean taking the very popular stance on a high salience social issue. And that's the campaign. That's the story. That's the end of it. Does Trump win on Tuesday? I don't want to. My model says yes, of course, but I don't want to like stake the claim to that because crazier things have happened. But the fact that even if I run the model, assuming that there is no bias in the polls and the polls are exactly accurate, and you still have a GOP plus 0.4 lead, like it's not happening. The polls would have to miss dramatically in Harris's favor in a way that's never happened to a party who doesn't have any momentum behind them. That's never been a thing. I've never seen that before. Again, will that mean it won't happen? Not necessarily. But it means that if it does happen, that is, at the time, an unprecedented thing. And yes, as I said before, the unprecedented thing has to happen at least once for a precedent to ever occur. But until that precedent occurs, you can't expect it to happen. If you're sitting here expecting something unprecedented to happen, that's just crazy. That makes no sense. It might happen, but it seems exceptionally unlikely. And then you consider how the campaigns went, and you start looking at the actual data. Again, I don't think you should look into early voting too much, but early voting returns this time versus 2020, and it's shockingly more Republican. It's actually more Republican to the point where I would almost entertain a conspiracy theory that Trump lost 2020 on purpose because he did everything wrong in 2020 vis-a-vis early voting, and he's seemingly doing everything right in 2024. Either he's a really quick learner or he lost on purpose in 2020, but I digress. That's just my pet theory that has no scientific or research basis into it. With that, I bid you all adieu, and I will see you Monday, probably, with something new.